Today I am at Oak Hill Cemetery again, and I wanted to talk to you about a man by the name of Ogden Green. He was the original sexton for Oak Hill Cemetery, and he's a man who dug 2,000 graves in his lifetime. So come along and join me on this story. It's a fascinating one. And let's learn something about one of the most interesting figures in Battle Creek's earliest history.
Ogden Green, in his own words, saw the first light of day in Russell, St. Lawrence County, New York, on November 30th, 1812. He learned the trade of a painter in Lockport, New York. He came by way of the canal to Detroit on his way to settle in Battle Creek from St. Lawrence County in New York when he was 24 years old. He had married Mary G. Baker, and when they arrived in Battle Creek, they spent the winter of 1836 to 1837 with an old friend from the East, Asa Phelps. If you've watched some of my other videos, I've mentioned Asa Phelps when I covered the history of the First United Methodist Church here in Battle Creek. He later settled on the edge of town on a street which was later to be called Green Street, named after him. Mr. Green was a sexton of the Methodist Church back in the log cabin days, and he was also sexton for the earliest cemeteries around Battle Creek before Oak Hill Cemetery was established. A sexton is a 14th century term which is defined as a caretaker for church property or a cemetery, whose duties include not only care of the grounds, but also the ringing of bells, the opening and closing of gates, the digging of graves, and the burying of the dead. Ogden Green had spent more years as a sexton than any man in Michigan as of 1898. He gave an interview in 1893 which offered a compelling insight into his own experiences as a sexton in the late 1800s, as well as conveying his own personal views on subjects that have long been the storyline of so many macabre forms of entertainment over the decades since, expounding on stories that took place over the course of 30 years while he was burying the dead. The article, which contained his original interview, ran on July 21st, 1893 in the Battle Creek Moon. A rewritten version of the same interview ran on November 13th, 1898 in the Sun Record. It contains the same information as the first interview, but it's clear that the author of this one did not interview personally Ogden Green. So now I'm going to include a majority of that original interview in this video so that you can hear from Ogden Green in his own words. In these articles, he refers to a potter's field. During that time in history, a potter's field was a burial place for paupers, unknown persons, and criminals. The origin of the term comes from its first use in 1777, referring to Matthew's 27:7, which reads, "They took counsel and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in." The earliest cemeteries in Battle Creek had a portion of the burial grounds set aside for this purpose. An article from 1872 in the Battle Creek Daily Journal showed that the directors of the Oak Hill Cemetery established a potter's field and removed the bodies that had been buried in the previous potter's field to Oak Hill Cemetery. In these same articles, Ogden Green refers to the time when the city of Battle Creek began to encroach on the first cemetery located on Champion Street, and Green was the one who transferred the bodies to Oak Hill Cemetery. He also moved bodies from the old Quaker Cemetery up on North Avenue to its new location, which is now present-day Quaker Park, and those bodies were subsequently moved in later years after Ogden Green passed to Oak Hill Cemetery. As I read this article, I will include a photo of Ogden Green next to his actual responses to the author who was interviewing him in the original article. The first article, written in 1893, was entitled "Our Old Sexton, Who Tolled the Church Bell for the Dead," and has dug the graves for and buried over 2,000 people in 29 years. Then it gives the quote from William Shakespeare, which I featured at the beginning of this video. The article then reads, "Yet in all ages the thoughts of grim death and the silent grave have aroused the imagination of men and filled their minds with apprehension and horror. For in that sleep of death what dreams may come? A gruesome, lonesome labor must be that of the grave digger who spends year after year in a remote burying ground, the maker of the dead man's bed." Undoubtedly, there is no man in Michigan who has spent as many years continuously doing sexton's work as our venerable citizen Ogden Green of Green Street, which was named after him. He is now in his 81st year and yet active. He is still frequently seen upon our street, reminding one of Oliver Wendell Holmes' poem, "The Last Leaf Upon the Tree." The Moon Reporter recently called upon Mr. Green at his home and was cordially received and readily consented to relate his experiences as a sexton. Yes, I was sexton for 29 years, and during that time have dug the graves for and buried over 2,000 people. Think of that! The grief, the woe, the sorrow, the tears the old sexton has been a witness to. No, I am not hard-hearted or unfeeling. My business made it necessary for me to take the scene of burials in a matter-of-fact way. The old burying ground was located on Champion Street, where the residence of John G. Hoyt now stands. I was sexton at that time. When Oak Hill Cemetery was located, assisted by Joel Fordham, I removed all of the bodies to the new ground. I was also the sexton for the Quaker burying ground, then located on North Avenue on the old Chandler Ford place. I removed all the bodies from that cemetery to the new ground, now known as the old Quaker burying ground on Fremont Street. David Waters helped me do the work. The first person buried in Oak Hill Cemetery was the wife of the late Dr. Edward Cox. There are frequent articles in the newspapers regarding the burying of people alive, and that question has been frequently discussed. Many people have a fear that such a horrible fate may overtake them and live in constant fear of being buried alive. Do you believe such a thing happens frequently? No, I do not. I have taken up hundreds of bodies for removal and reburial and never yet found but one that I thought had been buried alive. A Mrs. Blackman died here many years ago, very suddenly one Saturday, and she was buried on Sunday. Some years afterwards, I took up the body for reburial, and from the position I found her in the coffin, I have thought that she might have been buried alive. That is the only case that ever came under my own observation. I do not believe that it frequently happens. Did you ever find any bodies turned to stone or petrified? Only once, I believe. I took up one body once that took the united strength of 4 men to lift it out of the grave. I did not open the coffin because the friends were present and objected, but judging from the unusual weight, it must have been petrified. Some of the remains were in a fair state of preservation, and the most of them were decayed and crumbling to dust. I remember one odd circumstance. I took up one body, a man, and everything had been decayed except a bunch of something. I examined it and found it to be a bunch of matches. In those days, matches were not made separate, but were made in a block, and when you wanted one, you pulled it off. I remember this man as a great smoker. He had the matches in his best coat, and when they laid him out, they forgot to take out the contents of the pocket. The matches were all that there was left. It has been said that in an early day, body snatching was carried on extensively. Do you know of any cases? I do not. I frequently marked graves, but never found one disturbed by a body snatcher. Did you ever have anything happen at the graves in the way of an accident? No. Once, just as the friends had gathered about the grave, it caved in, and the mourners had to wait right there until I dug the grave anew. It was a painful suspense, but I worked hard to excavate it. Once a funeral came from the country without notifying me, and I had no grave dug. They had to wait for me to do the work. Once when I was away, I left my son to prepare a grave for a funeral that was to come at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They did not get there until 9 o'clock at night, and every one of the party mourners and all were gloriously drunk. You remember Mrs. Haviland, who murdered 3 of her children? The children were by 2 husbands. 2 of the children were taken away by friends, and 1 was buried here. Friends of the one came here afterward in the night, and I went up at midnight and took up the body for them. It was taken to Jackson for burial. Did you ever get frightened while at work? Never! I never was superstitious in the least, and never knew what fear was. There is no reason why a person should be afraid of the dead. It's the living I'm afraid of. The first murder in the city was the killing of a Mrs. Hopkins by her husband. The body was taken up to the cemetery and put in the little house that used to be there. I sat up all night with that body alone and walked around the house among the tombstones. I remember all night there alone with bodies several times. I don't believe in ghosts. One time, while the cemetery gate was open, 2 hogs got in, and I closed the gate at night, not knowing that they were in. The next morning, I found them there. That night, 2 young fellows were going up to Cornelius Fonda's and heard the swine grunt. Those boys ran like horses to the town. They came to me and said that they had heard groans in the cemetery. That's the nearest I can get to a ghost story. It was rather sad to see people buried in the potter's field. Often there were no mourners to these funerals. There were 4 soldiers buried in the potter's field. One of them was George W. Hayes. F.M. Sanderson, Enos Smith, and myself bought a lot, and I transferred the bodies. The 4 rest there today. 3 of them are unknown. The record of their names was lost. I was sexton during the war and buried the heroes who were brought back here. Some killed in battle, and others died of disease. The rest of the article, he discusses his early days as a sexton for the Methodist Church, as well as his journey to Battle Creek when he originally arrived here from New York, which I've already covered at the beginning of this video. Ogden Green in his lifetime served other roles in the city, including being a voluntary policeman appointed by the city mayor. He also served as a janitor for Schoolhouse No. 2 and was a popular figure among the students and teachers for many years. But he was a painter by trade, and over the years he painted the First Methodist Church, the First Congregational, and Presbyterian Church, besides a large number of residential homes in the Battle Creek area. Ogden Green died on February 18, 1899, at the age of 87. A year prior to his death in September 1898, he was referred to as one of the 7 remaining original pioneers still living in Battle Creek at the time. In the 3 decades he served Battle Creek as a sexton for multiple cemeteries, Ogden Green, with a shovel in hand, dug over 2,000 graves and became locally known in his time as the maker of the dead man's bed.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's tour through history, exploring the life of Ogden Green, a very fascinating man. I tried to include his own words whenever possible from the articles I was able to find on him. And it's certainly very interesting. I'm sure he would have been a fascinating man to sit down and talk with. And I'm really grateful that somebody in their time actually sat down and did ask him some key questions that made his story possible. And it was very interesting to research, and I had to do a lot of digging to find that information. But it was a fascinating adventure. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked today's video, please leave me a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me what you thought. Leave me a comment in the video channel so that I can see what you guys are thinking about it. And until next time, thanks for watching.